So we're just a few days away from the presidential elections in the United States. I know what you call them. You like to refer to them as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So maybe you can still give us a prediction. Which one is it going to be?
Well, I think that at this point in time, it's almost impossible to predict with any certainty who's going to win the election because all the polls are remarkably close. If I was forced to bet my life, I was told I had to bet, I would bet that Trump will win. He'll win the electoral vote, and I would bet that Harris wins the popular vote, and that it turns out like the 2016 election. But that's just a guess on my part.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to share who you're voting for?
No. But I will say that I'm not voting for Trump, and I'm not voting for Harris.
Oh, wow. But is there an independent candidate still running?
There are a number of candidates, and you can also in the United States write in candidates. In other words, I could write in your name.
Well, but that wouldn't make it. I'm not a U.S. Citizen, so that wouldn't make.
Yeah, well, I think voting for a third party is not going to make any difference. I mean, a number of my friends would say that who are profoundly anti-Trump, that if you don't vote for Harris, you'll end up with Trump. So in effect, voting for a third person or a third party is like voting for Trump.
Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't want to do that? No,
I won't vote for the Democrats because of the genocide in Gaza. Mm-hmm. I think that the Biden administration is complicit in the genocide, and genocide's a red line for me. And I would never vote for Biden or for Kamala Harris because, again, they're complicit in the genocide.
So you've already touched on this very sensitive subject that we were going to get to, Israel-Gaza, and we are in Germany, so this is also a very interesting topic to discuss in this country because you know the history. I mean, I don't need to lecture you on that, but maybe on the question of the president. So let me ask you this: which president do you think would be less aggressive on the foreign policy front?
I think it's quite clear that Trump would be less aggressive. I think Trump is not a warmonger. I think that Kamala Harris, like Joe Biden, they're basically warmongers. They've never seen a war that they didn't want to fight. I think in contrast, Trump is not interested in fighting wars. And I think where you see this most clearly manifested is in Europe. I mean, what Trump wants to do is shut down the war in Ukraine. He wants to have good relations with Putin and, more generally, good relations with the Russians. If Harris is elected, she'll basically continue Biden's policy, which is to play hardball with the Russians forever, do everything to topple Putin, and to keep the Ukraine war going forever. So I think that you see the distinction between the two candidates most clearly when you think about how they approach Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. You have also said in the past that the foreign establishment, which is also referred to as the blob, is pretty independent of which president is actually in power. So how is it possible that Trump can have his own idea of foreign policy concerning Ukraine, but maybe not in other foreign policy arenas?
Well, Trump can have his own foreign policy views or his preferences on any particular issue. And the question is, what will happen if he has a different perspective than the blob has? It will then be sort of Trump versus the blob. And my argument is, in those cases, the blob will win. Now, if you go back to Trump's first term, which was from 2017 to 2021, he had a number of fights with the blob. And in fact, one fight involved relations with Russia and relations with Putin, because even back then, Trump was interested in having good relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. But he failed. The blob beat him back. And he and his principal advisors are well aware that in his first time, the blob beat him. And their belief is that this time they're going to bring in seasoned veterans from the first administration, and they've learned a lot from that past experience. So this time Trump is going to beat the blob. And the one area where you're going to see that play out is Ukraine. When you think about Trump on foreign policy, there are three big issues that the United States cares about on the foreign policy front. One is China, containing China in East Asia. Number two, supporting Israel in the Middle East. And on those two issues, there's not much daylight between the blob on one hand and Trump on the other. So I don't see any big fights in either of those arenas. The place where there's likely to be a fight is over Ukraine and over relations with the Russians, because there the blob is much more in line with what Biden and Harris want to do and not with what Trump wants to do. So the $64,000 question, as we used to say when I was a kid, moving forward is who will win, Trump or the blob on the Ukraine-Russia issue.
You've also said that the U.S. is not interested in a diplomatic solution in the Ukraine war. And I figure when you speak about the U.S. in this quote that you're talking about the blob. But maybe you can explain to us why you think that the U.S. is not interested in diplomacy or negotiation in Ukraine, when you've mentioned that we have, like, the U.S. has three fronts that they're fighting, sort of, not all in military conflict: China, Israel, and Ukraine. Looking at those three, Ukraine is the least important. So why wouldn't they be interested in negotiating a peace deal after now over 2.5 years?
Well, the United States is run by people. This is certainly true with regard to the Biden administration. It would be true with regard to a Harris administration, and it's true of the blob. These people and this institution all believe that the United States is incredibly powerful and that it can use a big stick to get its way here, there, and everywhere. There's a little sense in the United States that you have to prioritize. When I look at these three theaters where the United States is involved, it's clear to me that East Asia is the most important area of the world because China is the greatest threat to the United States. It is a peer competitor. And this is why we're talking about pivoting to Asia, right? But when you talk about pivoting to Asia and therefore maybe pivoting away from Europe, the blob and the Biden administration don't want to hear that. They think we can be in Europe in full force, we can be in the Gulf or the Middle East in full force, and we can still pivot to East Asia. So, number one, we have no sense that we have to prioritize. And number two, we have a deep-seated faith in big stick diplomacy. We have a deep-seated faith that military force can solve all sorts of problems. And therefore, when you talk about diplomacy with Vladimir Putin, people say this is unthinkable. He's the second coming of Adolf Hitler. Nobody would negotiate with Adolf Hitler. Therefore, we're not going to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. But moreover, we don't have to, because we have this big stick and we have the capability to deal with the Ukraine scenario as well as the other scenarios we face.